Hello and welcome to the pilot edition of the Beertalkers. I'm Sophie Atherton and...
I'm Sam Hill. Together we're the Beertalkers, and this podcast will be bringing you news and views on the world of beer and brewing.
So every show will have a different theme, and we've decided to kick off with a discussion prompted by the rise of more expensive craft beers, the way beer is presented, the glass where it comes in, and the use of ingredients like champagne yeast, all of which led us to ponder the question, is beer posh?
Yes, but before we can answer that question, we need to work out what we mean by posh.
And that's exactly what head brewer at St Austell Brewery, Roger Ryman, wanted to get straight when I asked him if he thought beer was posh. Let's hear what he had to say.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I have been giving this some thought. I think essentially, before we even start, we have to get some sort of definition around the word posh and what that means. And I think, to me, the word posh actually has some sort of connotations of elitism and separation. And if we take that as a definition, I think fundamentally beer isn't and should not be posh. What I think is great about beer is that beer always has been the great leveller in society, and the pub is the one place where everyone can go and enjoy beer together and all be equal. So I actually think intrinsically with beer, what makes beer great is the fact that, to my mind, it isn't posh.
So let's use another piece of terminology, and I think you're absolutely right to question what is meant by the word posh. Do you think beer can be classy?
I think there is a difference between posh and classy. I would fundamentally think that definition is very, very important. And, I was thinking a little bit, because beer has always envied the place of wine and the reverence that is given to wine. But quite often I think actually wine is not posh. Wine is sort of, certainly at the bottom end of the market, is probably fur coat and no knickers, in that it has aspirations to class, but not always the depth or quality behind it. So beer can very definitely be classy, but I think that is different to being posh.
And so would you say that beer can be all things to all people?
Well, I think that is the great strength of beer, isn't it? The breadth and range and diversity of beers and the times and places that you can enjoy beer, I think, is more diverse than any other drink. It's from the relaxing pint in the pub to the, your Belgian beer cafe and your Trappist ale served in an elegant glass. These are all the wonderful different occasions where you can enjoy beer.
I think Roger summed up the debate we're about to have very well there.
Yeah, he raised a lot of good points. So if we take posh to mean something elite and separate, as Roger put it, then I guess we wouldn't want beer to be posh. But if we're talking about it being classy, then that's a good thing.
So maybe what we should really be asking is, can beer be posh, rather than is it posh?
Yeah, I think you're right. And one of the things that I did when I was researching for the show was to pick up the dictionary, and which is actually something that I used to do when I was at university. Every essay I ever wrote started with, in order to answer this question, one has to define what is meant by. But I think it's quite useful to do that. So to look up definitions and break down the question. And my dictionary defines posh as very smart and luxurious. And I think there are definitely beers out there that fit that description, but there's probably many more that don't.
Well, I think what we mean by posh is beers that are elevated from the norm. This could be a beer that's made in an unusual way with fancy ingredients, or even one that's promoted as somehow exclusive or rare or more sophisticated than the average pint. That might lead the beer to be more expensive or difficult to get hold of, which could make it more desirable even to a certain type of beer drinker.
I think that sounds pretty plausible actually as a definition. Have you got any beers in mind or any brewers in mind when you say that?
Well, I think that there's a trend for posh beers which has been going on for a while, and even more traditional breweries seem to be getting in on the act and bringing out limited edition beers. Not just the microbreweries. So you've got the likes of Badger's Collector's Edition, which is actually 50 quid a pop, or even a Shepherd Neame Generation Ale.
I think that's about £18 a bottle, but it comes in that sort of presentation wooden case, which is quite nice.
Well, There's also posh beers from the new wave of craft breweries like Brewdog. They've got their experimental range called Abstract. I think there's an ongoing challenge to encourage drinking beer at the dinner table as well, and I think to achieve that, breweries have been dressing up beers with classy packaging and larger bottles for sharing, for instance.
To me, that all sounds really rather appealing, but do you think you can take the idea of posh beer too far?
Well, I think you can. In certain circumstances, a posh beer with very high alcohol, or which is quite expensive, isn't really going to be relevant for an everyday occasion. I think as far as having a drink down the pub with your friends is concerned, these types of beers are actually completely irrelevant.
Oh, irrelevant's a really strong word.
Well, I think a lot of people just aren't interested in a fancy beer. And in the same way that most beer drinkers aren't that interested in how a beer is made. If it tastes good, they'll drink it. But if they have to pay over £5 a pint, then they probably won't bother. In actual fact, I can see a bit of a backlash on the way for these kinds of beers. On the other hand, though, if you wanted to treat yourself to something, or if you wanted to have a celebratory drink, normally people wouldn't necessarily turn to beer, and these beers might be the ideal thing to do that with.
So essentially, I think Roger's really hit the nail on the head. In the pub, we need to keep your average 4% session beers, whether it's a mass-produced lager, which we might not recommend or choose if Sam and I were in the pub. We wouldn't recommend that maybe, but whether we're talking lager or bitter, it needs to remain there at a reasonable price point that anybody can afford. But then, as Sam's been saying, there's also these products that are sort of up there, that are more expensive and that are rather aspirational, if you can live with the use of a bit of marketing speak. But that make people say, oh, I've had my pint of average, and now I'd really like to splash out on something a bit more adventurous, something a bit posh. But instead of ordering, say, a bottle of champagne, they splash out 20 or so quid on a bottle of Sriracha Ace, which is a really fantastic beer that Brooklyn Brewery make. And that takes beer from being something cheap you chuck down your neck on a Friday night, to being something you might choose really carefully as a treat, or even as something you could take round somebody's house if they'd invited you to a dinner party, rather than just being something lowbrow.
I think you might have a little bit of a jump there, though. I think we're a long way before I could turn up to a friend's house with a bottle of Sriracha Ace and for them to be that impressed with it. I guess that depends on the friend, though. I think you'd be quite happy for me to bring one round your house, so.
Hell yeah. Could it come round now? It was one of my Christmas beers, actually. Not that it's especially Christmassy, but it went really well in the end with our turkey dinner. So one of the other things we need to look at when we're trying to answer this question, is beer posh, or can beer be posh, is that we're talking about it as drinkers, and to a degree people who write about beer, and I mean I make my living out of beer, so it could be slightly different for us, but we're talking about it as consumers. And we ought to pay some attention to the usefulness of beer being posh if you're a brewer, or even a retailer or a publican. But do you think, Sam, that it's got value for them to position beer as a posh drink?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not really sure I can give a great answer on that. But I wonder how many of the breweries are actually making any money from the beers, or if they have more value to them as some kind of profile enhancer. There are some craft breweries in this country who make some incredibly outrageous beers, and
Are you talking about Brewdog?
well, Brewdog are the brewery that spring to mind, and some of their beers must cost an absolute fortune to make. But they're the beers that have brought them to the public's attention in a way that their normal beers haven't.
So they're using what we're calling a posh beer, although I accept that we haven't fully defined that yet. But perhaps posh is in the eye of the beholder, or indeed the mouth of the drinker. But they're using it as a sort of marketing tool to make people sit up and take notice of them and their other beers.
Well, yeah, and in their case, it's definitely working. By making the headlines, they're undoubtedly selling much more of their standard range and getting people into their bars. I think Brewdog might have a bit of an issue with us calling their beers posh, though. You could certainly say that they're exclusive.
Yeah, I don't think they'd like the description posh, but in terms of exclusive, there's plenty more of their beers that, probably more of their beers that I haven't had than beers that I have had. So I think they fall into that. How about the idea, just sort of moving on from that a little bit, how about the idea that casting beer as more of a high class or a sort of posh drink might be a way of refuting the negative reputation it sometimes has? And I'm talking about the way people and sometimes the media blame beer for every drunken incident or for obesity or whatever it is this week that alcohol's done wrong. It tends to be beer that gets the blame. But if we are promoting it as something more classy, could we kick all that into touch?
I think the efforts of some of the beers we'll be tasting today, I think it's very important that the breweries make these efforts to show the media what beer's really all about. And I agree that if you're going to abuse alcohol, you're not necessarily going to be doing it with any normal off-the-shelf beer, and especially not the beers we're talking about here. You're going to be doing it with kind of cheap cider or spirits or something far worse.
Beth's. Sorry. Okay, we should move on from talking about negative things and people abusing alcohol, and actually move on to something far better. The first of our potentially posh beers is actually a lager, and it's Chapel Down's Curious Brew, and it's 4.7% ABV. And maybe some of you might think that that's a bit of a contradiction in terms, a posh lager, but Sam and I, from different ends of the country, because we record this from different ends of the country, we're going to open some up and do a bit of a tasting of it now. So you may hear the sounds of bottles and such like as we open the beer. I hope it hasn't warmed up too much. So I'll pour a little bit of this into... I don't know what you call this type of glass. I might put a picture of it online so you can see it, but it's a nice glass.
I've actually poured mine into the glass, which an actual Curious Brew glass, which is quite a large stemmed goblet.
Looks like a big goblet for a small bottle of beer.
Well, it holds a pint. But I have seen this on tap in a couple of places actually, and also you can buy growlers of it in Whole Foods. I saw the other day.
So I've opened mine. I'm having a little look at it. So we'll have a little. Sam and I'll run through a bit of a tasting. So I've got mine in a stemmed glass, and it's kind of a glass that's wider at the bottom and then a bit narrower at the top. I use this glass for a lot of beers, and it tends to lend something to all of them. It's a really grey day where I am in the middle of winter, so I'm having trouble seeing getting the best colour representation of this, but I think it's quite golden, and it's got a sort of loose, bubbly white head, and Sam's already necking his. One of the pleasures of drinking beer, and something that brewers do when they put beer when they make beer, is the aroma of the beer, and which if you're beer lovers already listening to this, you'll know that, but if you're sort of new to beer, you might not know that. So we're smelling the beer, but if you have got a bit of a cold, then you're not going to appreciate that. So I'll and poor Sam is suffering in this way as we record, and I think this has got quite a creamy aroma. I feel, and gentle sort of fruitiness to it as well. I know that's a bit generic. I'm kind of I'm thinking maybe sort of peaches, but not sort of overwhelmingly peachy, but quite sort of creamy. And Sam's been using his to soothe his cold by drinking it already, but I haven't tasted mine, and I'm just going to taste mine, and maybe Sam would. Hopefully it hasn't. Your cold is not affecting your taste buds either, and maybe you'd like to just talk a little bit about what you're tasting while I taste mine.
Yeah, it's got a nice creamy, lagery taste to it. It's interesting you say about the fruity notes, because it looks like I think it's hopped, dry hopped with Nelson Sauvin, which is a hop which is supposed to give wine-like characters to beer.
I really like this, actually. I mean, I think now I've tasted it, I think it tastes quite creamy as well, in a good way. For anybody who's who's very knowledgeable about beer. Sometimes those sort of creamy flavours can be perceived as maybe what we call an off flavour, but that's not what I would call this. But it's got a real nice sort of. It's got quite a lot of body for a lager, and I think maybe that's what I mean by the sort of creaminess. Sam is far more knowledgeable about things to do with wine than I am, and I'll just get you, Sam, to say why we picked this, beer for this programme, because it's got a special ingredient, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, the people who make this beer, Chapel Down, are actually one of Britain's most celebrated winemakers. They specialise in British fizz, and this beer is set apart from other lagers because it's made with champagne yeast. I'm not sure if it lends anything necessary to the flavour, but it may be that the champagne yeast has actually given it a more creamy texture, or the creamy texture you were talking about.
So it's 4.7%. It is a nice golden colour, and it's keeping its head quite well in my glass, and it's clinging to the glass, which is generally a sort of sign of a good beer, and also shows that I've cleaned my glasses really well. It's got this kind of creamy, slightly sort of fruity aroma. It's quite full-bodied. It's definitely got more flavour than I think you would think of for a lager if you've ever been unfortunate enough to have some mass-produced lager. It doesn't taste of much, in my opinion, but this has got a real depth of flavour.
Definitely, I think it's a really good attempt at making a lager which appeals to a beer lover, because it's got a lot of flavour there, lovely aftertaste, and I'd happily drink this down the pub, to be honest.
Yeah, I'd happily drink it down the pub, and I think in a nice glass, I could feel quite posh drinking this. I see myself in a nice, summery pub garden, and as Sam said, they do it on draft as well as in bottle. We've got these little 330 milliliter bottles for the programme tasting, but they do it on draft as well, and I can see myself in a summer garden in a nice floaty white dress, which Sam's laughing at because I'd never wear a floaty white dress. With a nice stemmed glass, drinking this in the summer. I think you could feel pretty classy drinking this.
Definitely. I'd like to think it could replace a glass of champagne in that circumstance.
Yeah. I think it's certainly got more flavour than some of the champagnes I've had, but maybe that says more about the cheap rubbish champagne that I've had than it does about champagne in general.
So Chapel Down are the first vineyard I've heard about getting involved in making beer. Do you think that vineyards making their own beers will make beer a posher drink?
I think that's a really good question, actually, and but the thing is, though, and obviously I'm not a massive wine drinker. I would say, is wine really that posh? It conjures up images of poshness in some ways, and when you think of maybe vintage wines or a £40 bottle of Burgundy. But if you go back to what Roger Ryman was saying about wines at the lower end of the market, the kind of cheaper bottles that you can pick up in the supermarket, I think is what he was thinking of. He said they were all fur coat and no knickers.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a bit dangerous to place wine on a pedestal like that. But for some people, it is on that pedestal, and maybe a beer like this, or rather beers being made by vineyards, will make people who are already wine drinkers more keen to try beer, because they'll see it as being a quality product because of its association with wine.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that the more people that drink beer, the better.
Amen to that.
Okay, you're listening to the Beertalkers podcast, and we are discussing whether it's possible for beer to be posh. But before we carry on, we should tell you how you can get in touch with us.
Indeed, because we'd like to know what you think about posh beer and of the beers that we're tasting today. So you can find us on Twitter, where we are simply at the Beertalkers. We have got a "the" in front of it, the Beertalkers.
And if you've come to listen to this podcast without going via our website, you can find the show notes, including details and pictures of the beers we've tasted, on this edition of the programme by visiting www.thebeertalkers.com.
So, should we have another posh beer then?
Why not?
So our second and final beer of the show is one that certainly sounds rather posh. It's from the Sharps Connoisseurs range. Now, you may be familiar with Sharps as the brewers of Doom Bar, which is available in many, many pubs everywhere. It's a very sort of popular bitter. Or you might be familiar with the Chalkies beers, Chalkies Bark and Chalkies Bite, which were brewed in collaboration with the chef Rick Stein. And it's fair to say the Connoisseurs range has more in common with the Chalkies beers than it does with Doom Bar.
That's right. These beers have been created by Sharp's head brewer, Stuart Howell, a man who apparently lives and breathes beer, as it were, and has come up with 3 posh beers with the idea that they'll be the perfect match for food. And the one we've decided to sample for the show is the Quadrupel, so named because it's made using 4 different malts, 4 different hops, 4 yeasts, and then undergoes 4 fermentations.
And with that sort of story, it's got to be posh. That sounded really disparaging, but it does. All the 4s. Okay, I'm going to open mine now. And Sam's opening his at the other end of the country. What sort of glass have you got for this one, Sam?
Well, because they're recommending this as a kind of an after-dinner drink, I'm pouring it into a brandy balloon.
Nice, nice. He looks very pleased with himself, I have to say, because I can see him over the medium of Skype. I'm pouring mine into a wine goblet, and it is more of a goblet than a standard wine glass. Now, something we actually didn't do with the Curious Brew was talk too much about the packaging, and I will just take a step back and say the packaging of the Curious Brew bottle, it is as well as the beer, is sort of quite classy with a golden label, lots of gold on the label and gold and red, and it looks, I would say, different to your average beer bottle. And in common with the Curious Brew, the Quadrupel has got this sort of gold. It's not gold leaf, because that would be insane to think that it was gold leaf. But it's got a gold label, gold round the edges, and a gold neck label, a gold rimmed neck label. It's quadruple ale, and it's 10% alcohol. It's 10% ABV.
It's pretty hefty for a beer. It's certainly not something you drink every day.
I don't know.
It's a really dark caramel colour, not dissimilar to a cola. It's got kind of a thin head.
So when you hold this beer up to the light, it's got a very reddish colour, and I think that's it, you know, in similar to a cola, as you were saying. And the marketing spiel is that it's ruby coloured, but if you just look at it without sort of holding it up to the light, it's very brown, and it reminds me of the colour of molasses, or a very, very dark brown sugar. So I'm going to give the beer a little sniff now, and lead on the aroma of the beer because of Sam's cold. And I think it's got a very noticeably sweet aroma. It's the brown sugar as per the sort of its colour, and it's quite raisin-like. You have to know this if you're listening to this. With both of these beers, Sam has started drinking before me, and I'm insanely jealous that he's managed to get it down his neck before I have. But that's because he's more of a professional, obviously. And
it's an automatic response for me. I sniff a beer and then sip it straight away.
And you're right to do so.
I can't quite get the aromas, but the alcohol's certainly cutting through my cold, I can tell you that.
I'm sure it'll do you the power of good. Oh, this is really tasty. Sam and I have had this beer before, actually. We had it at something called the European Beer Bloggers Conference, where I seem to recall that there were some bottles. It came out with dinner, and I do seem to recall that there was a bottle that went under Sam's coat that he ran off with before I could do the same, actually. I don't know whether you can... I know when we tasted it once before, Sam, that we talked about the fact that you didn't notice straight away it was 10%. Do you think you've noticed it more today with a cold?
I think because it's so sweet, you don't notice the alcohol as much. So it could be quite dangerous. You could end up swigging it a little bit like a fizzy pop, but it will go well with a dessert or even Christmas pudding. I think this would be great with a Christmas pudding, even though that's we're a month. That was a month ago now.
Well, you could get some in and have it ready for next Christmas as an antidote to all those hideous Christmas beers that get released that aren't Christmassy at all. So, I mean, as we've been saying, these beers, there's a whole range of them, and this is just one of the shops connoisseurs range. And they've been designed to go with food, and the Quadrupel in particular has been apparently matched with artisan cheeses. And if you're one of those people like me that sometimes think, artisan, what does that mean? I would just say, a really well-made cheese that's not, shrink wrapped in a that you would buy in the supermarket, something that comes in greaseproof paper instead. It's meant to go with cheeses, it's meant to go with high cocoa solids chocolate, and it's meant to go with chocolate desserts. And I'm a much bigger fan of cheese than I am of desserts, actually. And I would love to see what this was like with a cheese board. What do you think, Sam?
I would also love to see what it would be like with cheese. I think it would easily replace port or Madeira in that kind of after dinner drink. It's luxurious, it's rich, and it gets the job done.
Oh, it doesn't it just, doesn't it? It's the kind of beer. I think it's fair to say that's so posh that it makes it difficult to record a podcast. So one of the things that seems to make a beer into what we're calling a posh beer is it being specifically created to go with food, like these Sharps connoisseurs beers have been. And although we and other beer lovers might not want to get engaged into that battle with wine, I think it's true to say that when it comes to food, beer can go places that wine just can't go. Making a beer that goes with food is a way of elevating beer up and raising it and taking it from being just a drink into something really special that can really make an occasion.
I think beer has more to give as well, as far as food matching is concerned, than wine ever could do. The idea of wine and cheese, for instance, is not a completely valid one, in that wine can often destroy cheeses and vice versa. Cheese can make a wine really astringent and dry, and wine can completely demolish anything the cheese has got to offer.
Yeah, I've also heard that the archetypal wine and cheese party came about as a way of disguising cheap and nasty wine, because cheese coats the palate and then nobody can tell how awful the wine is. But maybe I'm just a bitch. No, but I have actually read that somewhere.
Well, there is something to be said for cheese and wine, and I think in a lot of cases, though, that beer just lifts everything to another level. You get some fascinating matches, and there are very few cheeses that won't benefit from a nice glass of beer. And the other thing that beer has to offer, which wine doesn't, is that the range of styles of beer means that there'll always be something to go with the dish that you're preparing, whether it's a lambic or a gueuze to go with a fish dish, or a double chocolate stout to go with the dessert.
I think you're right, and the subject of beer and food is such a broad one that we'll probably devote a whole future programme to it. So we'll probably leave it at that for now and round things up for this show, where we posed the question, is beer posh? And found that we probably should have actually asked, can beer be classy?
Well, whether you say posh or classy, I think that if the beers we've tried today are anything to go by, then yes, they can be. But I'm not sure if that's down to the beer itself or the way it's perceived, and I think good packaging and PR can go a long way to changing the perception of beer and hopefully encourage more people to try something new.
Which I think can only be a good thing. So if you want beer to be posh, it can be, and if you don't want beer to be posh, it doesn't have to be. So today we've looked at what makes a beer posh, whether it's the high alcohol, whether it's the packaging, whether it's a brewery putting out something that's a bit wacky and out there to attract attention to themselves. And we talked to Roger Ryman, head brewer at St Austell Brewery, and he was a little bit worried that there was a danger of elitism and separation if beer was too posh or classy, and he saw beer as being the great leveller and being capable of being all things to all people.
And we've tasted Chapeldown's Curious Brew, which is a lager made with champagne yeast. And from Sharps Connoisseurs range, we've had the Quadrupel. You can find show notes, including details and pictures of the beer, at www.thebeertalkers.com.
And you can tweet us at the Beertalkers to tell us what you thought of this, our pilot show, and with your thoughts about posh or classy beer. And in the meantime, we thank you for listening and hope you'll listen to the next podcast in late February or early March 2013, when we'll discuss another beer-related topic and sample some brews relating to it.
Indeed we shall. We've been the Beer Talkers. Thanks for being the beer listeners.
Goodbye.
Bye.